We're excited to have some people here in store in RJ Julia here in Madison. We've got several people joining us online as well, and we're very excited to have Jamie Brenner with us this evening. Jamie is the author of 6 novels, including Blush, The Forever Summer, and the new one, Guilt. She grew up in suburban Philadelphia on a steady diet of Jackie Collins and Judith Krantz novels. Later moved to New York City to live like the heroines of her favorite books. Jamie now divides her time between Philadelphia and Provincetown. Speaking of some of the novels that you mentioned, Jackie Collins, Judith Krantz, one of the things I was most interested in as I was looking up, reading a little bit of your history was on your website and your bio. You have quite an extensive list of some of the books that have influenced you ever since you were young, with Judy Blume, the novels when you were in middle school also, as well as some of the authors that you love now also.
Yes.
So it's really exciting. It's always interesting to see a writer who's also a reader. But I had the chance to read Guilt recently, and although it's outside of what I normally read, I was really excited. It's such a great mystery. It all kind of revolves around this elusive and exciting diamond, the electric rose, a 30-carat pink stone. Yeah, exactly. And there's a great mystery, but of course a little bit of romance, some excitement, a lot of family drama. But it was really great. I'm excited, and I'm really excited to tell my wife about it, actually.
Oh.
She's going to love my recommendation.
Thank you.
But,
Well, thank you for venturing into women's fiction territory.
well, I'm encouraged to do so more often.
All right,
So,
all right.
Yeah, thank
Then
you for
my job
joining
then.
us, and we'll
Thank you
turn the
so
time
much.
over to Jamie.
Thank you. So, ladies, let me think where to start. Yeah, this is my 7th novel. I've been publishing a novel every summer since 2016. And one thing people ask me is, how do you keep coming up with ideas? And I really get ideas from all the places I visit, particularly Provincetown, where I've set 3 of my books. But for Guilt, I actually got the idea for this story when I was in Sag Harbor researching my novel Drawing Home. I went into the store called Matriarch, and it's a little boutique, and they only carry female designers, jewelry and clothing, and I think some books too. And I saw this display case with these letters and numbers. I'm wearing one now. I don't know where it went, but these so this is like a little J. And I thought, oh, that's really interesting. And she said, oh, that's Lulu Frost's Plaza collection. When they were dismantling the hotel to renovate it, she went in and collected all the door fixtures and turned the letters and numbers into charms. And I just love that idea because, it's personal because it's your initial, but it's a little piece of New York City history. So it's like, it made me think about like jewelry and why we buy certain pieces and what gives jewelry meaning. And, does it have to be the most expensive ring, or could it just be a token we pick up somewhere on a vacation? So I thought about jewelry and the messaging I got about jewelry growing up versus the way I've actually experienced it as an adult. So I thought this is worth exploring in a book. And usually when I set out to write a book, the first thing I do is talk to the people who are experts in that field or who are local to that town. So I contacted Lulu Frost's creator and designer, a woman named Lisa Salzer. And I went to her studio and I asked her, can I come watch you work to do research for a book I'm thinking of writing? And she said yes. She was so lovely. But this was February of 2020. So before I knew it, that was not going to happen. Everything shut down. And for the first time, I had to write a book without being able to really meet with people or see things firsthand. And it was daunting. But fortunately, what do book lovers do? They turn to books, and there are some fabulous nonfiction books about jewelry. And they really, one in particular, really shaped this book. It's called Stoned, Jewelry, Obsession, and How Desire Shapes the World. And she really goes through the whole history of jewelry, starting like in antiquity through Marie Antoinette up till today, and talks about how certain jewels were made to be more valuable than others, and how the desire for these gems and what people did to acquire them, how it shaped relationships and historical moments and whole civilizations. Fascinating. So there were three main things I took from her book that formed this story. First, she writes about how diamond engagement rings weren't even a thing here in this country until about 80 years ago. About the same time we started having microwave ovens. So it really is a very modern creation, and it was very much a marketing ploy on the part of De Beers to move these stones, which were plentiful but not inherently valuable. And they invented the whole concept of the 4 C's, color, cut, clarity, I forget the fourth one, so that if people couldn't buy a large stone, they could at least feel good that theirs had great clarity. I mean, it was an amazing manipulation. So I thought that's really interesting, because I grew up in the 70s and 80s, all the classic jewelry, Tiffany De Beers advertising, diamond is forever, and it's like the most important piece of jewelry you'll ever own. So that kind of blew my mind. And she wrote about how emeralds were originally the stone everyone wanted, from antiquity up until about 200 years ago, and how the color green, to this day we equate it with money and wealth. It's literally the color of our dollars, and how we are physiologically wired to recognize and seek out the color green. And then you think about, oh, well, traffic light go, they chose green. So it sort of connected the dots for all these things we take for granted, and she grounded them in sort of jewelry lore. And the last thing she wrote about, or not the last thing she wrote about, but the last thing that really stuck with me was the idea of curses and cursed diamonds. Because I always had a fascination with these large stones like the Hope Diamond, and the stories of people who acquire them and then tragedy strikes. And she starts that section of the book talking about Marie Antoinette's stone, the French blue. And the French blue, legend has it, was originally the third eye of an idol in India, and it was stolen and then sold. And it was given to Marie Antoinette, and right before she was taken away to the guillotine, her jewelry was stripped from her, and that particular stone disappeared. And it didn't resurface until 1823, when it resurfaced with the name we know, the Hope Diamond. And every subsequent owner has had tragedy befall them, and they've worked really hard to sort of overcome that, to try to market it as something that is, just beautiful and get rid of the taint of tragedy. But the stories live on. There's a 195 carat black diamond called the Black Orlov, and a similar story. It had been stolen. Everyone who managed to acquire it suffered deaths, loss of fortune, all sorts of things. So one thing the writer of this book started exploring, which I thought was interesting, is there such a thing as a curse? Or is the greed that it takes to acquire such treasures essentially a self-fulfilling prophecy that's going to lead us to bad ends? So that was the beginning, the thought of greed and curses. It gave me the Pavlin family, the family in Gilt. And they made their fortune selling diamond engagement rings. And they had a slogan, "A diamond is love." And even though they really dominated the market, it was never enough. And the father in the family decided, for a publicity stunt, he was going to pit his 3 daughters against one another and see which one won the prized family gem, the Electric Rose, which is a 30 carat pink diamond. And the woman who ultimately won it, she died tragically, and when the book begins, her estranged daughter returns to the family looking for that stone that she knows should have been hers. But as a budding jewelry designer herself, she also is coming back to take the whole company, the whole thing. So I'll read a little bit of the beginning of this. Her name's Gemma. New York City, 2004. She reached for her mother's hand, excited and just a little bit afraid. The sun was beginning to set on Fifth Avenue, and cars were at a standstill. Reporters crowded the sidewalk, and onlookers pressed against metal security barriers. Over here, photographers called out, and her parents stopped for a moment, her mother leaning down to whisper to her, "Smile for the camera." "Paulina, show us the ring," someone called, and her mother flashed her left hand. A woman stepped forward holding a copy of the magazine and asking for an autograph. It seemed to take forever to reach the jewelry store on the corner of 53rd Street, a 7-story limestone and granite building her grandfather called a monument to love. The entranceway was engraved with her family name. Tonight, display windows were filled with black and white photographs of legendary couples, Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton, Marilyn Monroe and Joe DiMaggio, Grace Kelly and Prince Rainier, and in front of each photo, a Pavlin & Co. diamond engagement ring, just waiting to be bought by a customer with a love story of their own. It was the 10th anniversary of Pavlin & Co.'s most famous diamond of all, a 30-carat pink stone called the Electric Rose. Her grandfather, Alan, gifted the treasure to the first of his 3 daughters to get engaged, her mother. That afternoon, her mother had let her try it on. It was so beautiful she couldn't take her eyes off of it. The color of a pale rose petal, but also clear like a drop of water. Gemma had to clamp her small fingers tightly together to keep the ring from tilting over. "One day it'll be yours," her mother said. The thing was, while everyone in the family loved talking about the ring, no one seemed to ever want to talk about her parents' actual engagement, or wedding, or anything about her parents at all. Gemma was too afraid to press with questions. Sometimes she worried things were too perfect, that it could somehow all disappear. When the car arrived to whisk them down Fifth Avenue, her father looked at them both and said, "You two are more beautiful than any diamond in the world." Gemma's parents guided her inside Pavlin & Co., the vast sales floor transformed into a wonderland of sparkling diamonds everywhere you looked, in glass display cases, on the hands of the glamorous guests, and in the framed photos on the walls. The photos were advertisements from the long history of Pavlin & Co., starting back in 1947, with a black and white picture, now recognized all over the world, of a man on one knee in the snow, slipping a diamond solitaire ring on the finger of a willowy brunette in a ball gown. Above them, in elegant script, the sentence, "A diamond says love." With those 4 simple words, her great-grandfather had created the idea of the diamond engagement ring. Her mother told her the story over and over again, the way other little girls were told fairy tales. "There was a time when people didn't buy diamond engagement rings," her mother said, "not until our family made them important." They passed the orchestra playing near the gilded elevators, and her grandmother rushed toward them. Constance, with her eternally blonde bouffant hair and head-to-toe designer outfits, seemed like a queen to her. "You're late," Constance said. "Come along, everyone's waiting for you." The rest of the family was assembled on the podium, Alan looking distinguished in his tuxedo, and her mother's 2 older sisters, Aunt Elodie and Aunt Celeste. Like her grandmother, her aunt seemed regal and somewhat unknowable. Aunt Elodie was Alan's right hand at Pavlin & Co., while Aunt Celeste lived far away at a beach. Gemma wished she was closer with her mother's sisters. Maybe that would help fix the nagging sense that something was wrong. She was especially uncomfortable around Elodie. There was just something about the way her aunt looked at her. Uniformed guards encircled the podium as her grandfather stepped towards the microphone. On either side of him, glass cases displayed glittering diamond rings in every shape and color, yellow and white and even a rare blue stone set in platinum. Of course, none of them compared to the ring on her mother's finger. "Gemma," Aunt Elodie said, a loud whisper, placing a hand on her shoulder, "don't you find it interesting that with all this security, a thief can still hide in plain sight?" "What?" "Oh, give it a rest, Elodie," her mother said. "You'd like that, wouldn't you?" Confused, Gemma looked between her mother and her aunt. Her stomach tensed, and that feeling came over her again, the sense of something terribly wrong. "Gemma, go over there and stand with Grandma," her mother said. "Why?" She didn't want to leave her side. "Please, just do it," her mother said, a rare flash of annoyance in her voice. Biting her lip, she dutifully walked to the other end of the podium. What just happened? She blinked back tears, then told herself she had no reason to be upset. Looking out at the crowd, she knew she was lucky to be exactly where she was in that moment. Everyone wanted to be a Pavlin, to have beautiful things and be surrounded by love. So what if her Aunt Elodie and her mother didn't get along? It wasn't the end of the world. But something deep down told her that it could be. Thank you. That is the beginning. And so Gemma goes on, as I mentioned, a journey to find the stone that she always believed should have been hers. But she finds some other things along the way, which is, what's really important in life and what does family mean, and really, as a jewelry designer, for the first time, she actually, I think, begins to understand what jewelry actually means and what makes it valuable. So that is Guilt. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
Yeah, we'd love to have some time to ask questions, anything you're interested about this book, probably the other books also.
Oh,
anything-
yeah, sure.
Anything we'd like to have.
Absolutely. We could talk about Blush, if anyone read my novel from last summer, set on a winery in the North Fork of Long Island. I didn't really get to see many people because things were still dicey last summer, so I'm happy to talk about that if you happen to have read it.
Yeah. I've got a few questions to start off with also. I'm interested, this is an easy one first.
Okay.
The Pavlin family name, how did you come up with that? Is it any significance to it? Just something that you found and liked the sound of?
Yeah, no, there was no significance. I have no idea where I came up with it. But I think I tried some other things that were more, kind of elegant, romantic sounding. But I just liked it. It was simple, and I felt like something that could be an institution.
Yeah, gotcha. I was interested also that the beginning of the novel, there's a lot of the plot is set in New York City and kind of like the high fashion, jewelry world, but then it pretty quickly moves to Cape Cod, Provincetown, like much more maybe low key or down to earth maybe locations.
Yeah.
But I'm interested with what significance is there, or is there any special significance with the setting of the book?
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, just on a practical level, I wrote this the summer of 2020, and we've been living in New York City, and it was just a terrible time, and my husband knew my favorite place is Provincetown. I've set several books there. So I wasn't necessarily planning on setting this book in Provincetown, but we ended up moving there for the whole summer while I started this book. And I realized it actually was the perfect setting because, as you mentioned, New York, you have all that glitters and sort of like the superficial glamour and money and fast pace. And Provincetown is the exact opposite. It's down to earth and artistic and earthy and literally, they call it Land's End because you're at the very tip of the Cape. So to contrast the two types of, attitudes towards jewelry and the two different legs of her family, moving her from New York to Provincetown really served the story well. So I was happy to make this my third Provincetown novel.
Interested. I've got a couple more.
Okay.
I'll keep shaping. But I'm interested. So the three sisters
Yes.
are pretty significantly different. They appear very different, especially in the beginning. We kind of learn a lot more about that family dynamic. But I'm interested. Which sister do you think maybe you're the most like, or were there any of the three sisters that you drew heavily from someone in your own family or your own life?
Sure. So there's three sisters. Okay. So one is Elodie, who has always been chomping at the bit to take over from her father. And when the book opens, she is at the helm of Pavlin & Co. She lives on Park Avenue. She has a very elevated life. And she never married, never had kids. Her whole identity is wrapped up in being the face of Pavlin & Co. Her sister, Celeste, on the other hand, opted out of the whole business, moved to Cape Cod as a young woman, and opened an antique shop selling sort of forgotten treasures with her partner of several decades. And I think for every book, because I often have either three sisters or three generations of women, and regardless of age or personality, there's a little bit of me in every one of them. And I always like telling novels from usually 3 or 4 points of view, because I get to, explore all of those, because it's the contrasting points of view of the same experience to me, I think, that makes stories interesting and life interesting. In Blush, there's a grandmother, mother, and granddaughter, and they start a book club together, reading these books that were bestsellers in the 70s and 80s. And I had so much fun looking at one book, but from the perspective of 3 different generations, because the way we experience a story has so much to do with the way we experience the world growing up. And we bring all of our insights and baggage and ideas to it. So someone who reads Chances in the year 2020 is very different from someone who read it in 1985 or whatever year it published, I think around then. For every book, it's always about the differences in these women and how they can be in the same beach house or the same town or the same business, and they're all experiencing it in a completely different way. And how they reconcile those differences is usually the thing that keeps the story going. Oh, one more thing I want to mention. So one thing I've been doing the past 5 months, which is fun. So last summer I was doing a lot of Zooms talking about Blush and also talking about the books the characters read in Blush. And I was surprised how many people had not ever read Jackie Collins or Judith Krantz or any of the books that really made me want to write that I read when I was growing up. So I've started a Zoom book club called the Throwback Book Club. And every other month we read a book from the 80s or 90s. And we're on our 5th book. We're meeting on August 9th, we're reading Chances by Jackie Collins, and Jackie Collins' daughter is going to Zoom in and join us, which I'm really excited about. I can't wait to talk to her. I mean, she was a young teenager when her mother was writing this blockbuster, so she should have some interesting perspective. But we read, we just finished reading Outer Banks by Anne Rivers Siddons, which I loved when I first read it 30 years ago, and I loved it equally now. And that's another interesting sort of exercise. Reading a book you love when you were in college or when at a different stage in life, read it now and see if you feel the same about it. Because I realize now sometimes it wasn't the book, it was just that I needed that book at that particular time, and now it just doesn't speak to me in the same way. But Outer Banks was still wonderful. We reread An Inconvenient Woman by Dominic Dunn, which is timelessly fabulous. I mean, his storytelling, I miss him so much. We reread Mistral's Daughter, which is probably my all-time favorite novel. And like I said, we're going to do Chances in August. So if you're interested at all, it's very casual. We really, it's sort of become the same people every month, and we have a very chill conversation. We start out saying, okay, does this book hold up, or does it really only work in the time it was written? That's always the first discussion point. On my website, jamiebrenner.com, there's a tab that says Book Club. And if you put your email address in there, you'll be signed up for the Zoom link. And I also always announce what our next book will be. I often post discussion topics in advance, and then the night before I send out the Zoom link. And like I said, it's very informal. I often see people popping in, they're literally in bed. Like, I feel like they're barely awake. Some people don't speak, they lurk, but whatever you want to do to join in is fun. But it's just interesting, because everyone has a different memory of when they first read it. Or there was a young woman last time, she was probably in her 20s, and she never read any of these books before, so her perspective was welcome.
Yeah.
So
Did the majority feel like they did hold up, or not so much?
I would say the only book that people felt didn't really hold up was Lace by Shirley Conran. Only because, I mean, first of all of these books, none of them would be published today, first of all. Like, they would never get away with half the things they said, or, scenes, the way certain, like, love scenes play out, would never, ever happened. So I tell young people, you have to put this in the context in which it was written, and this was not meant to be some violent, non-consensual scene.
Right.
Like, that was just sort of the way, like watch Dynasty, Blake
Yes,
throw
yes.
Crystal into the bed.
Right.
Yeah, so I have to give warnings, do not be offended, this was published a long time ago, although it doesn't feel that long ago, but sensibility-wise, it may as well be 100 years ago.
Right.
Another difference is these books are so long. So they're 600, 700, 800 pages, and we're getting very used today to being able to sit down and finish a book, in a night or two if that's what we want to do. And these aren't really books you can consume in a few sittings. Like, it's a project. That's why we've been doing it every other month. So there's plenty of breathing room, and you don't feel rushed, because these women really do a deep dive into these characters and settings. And I mean, Judith Krantz could spend a whole page describing a woman's hair cascading, which I think is a particular talent I wish I had. Yeah, so that's been fun, and I welcome you to join us.
Thank you.
We've got a few more questions coming from the virtual chat.
Sure.
That sounds good. Okay, so you spoke a little bit about this earlier, but one person wanted to know, how is Guilt different or similar to your other novels?
Sure. It's probably more similar than different. It's a return to my favorite beach town, Provincetown, which is also the setting of The Forever Summer and Summer Longing. We have generations of women. We have family secrets, and we have a woman who wants something really badly and something keeps getting in her way. So in those ways, it's very much like my other stories. I think the thing that makes a difference is, the jewelry world becomes a character in itself. As a motif, as a thing that people are actually doing, whether it's looking at estate jewelry or making jewelry or trying to track down jewelry. So I really do try to peel back the curtain on a very specific subculture. There's a book I read also that was helpful called, Diving for Starfish, nonfiction, by a woman named Sherry Burns. And she was writing a biography of Millicent Rogers, the socialite, who had a very unique piece of jewelry, and it disappeared. And this woman, Sherry Burns, went on a quest to find where this piece of jewelry went. And through reading that book, I saw how auctions work, how sort of backdoor dealings can make something disappear if a buyer does not want anyone to know they've paid a certain amount for something super valuable. The way things are copied, and like the whole world of finding originals versus fakes, and that was a wonderful book too. So if you read Guilt and want more of the world, the two books I mentioned they read like novels, even though they're absolutely true.
Excellent. Okay, we've got another question from the virtual event. This person says, I'm not a wine drinker, but I learned so much about the wine business while reading Blush. They asked, how did you do research for your books?
Okay, so fortunately, I wrote Blush in the summer of 2019, and I was very fortunate to be able to go to the North Fork and spend time on the vineyards out there, a particular one called Vidal Cellars. And I walked through the fields and talked to the vineyard manager, and she taught me just the quirky little details, like that if they don't put up netting, turkeys will come in and gobble the clumps of grapes whole, like a pelican. And I didn't know that all grapes begin green. I think I'm getting this right. They begin green and then they turn red for red grapes, red wine, through this process called veraison. Like, they don't start as red grapes. So very hands-on. I met some knowledgeable people. I took classes in New York City at Murray's Cheese. They did these great wine and cheese pairings. So I learned about the wine and the cheese together, which I was able to, incorporate into the book. And there's great books about wine as well. There's a book called Wine and Words by Letty Teague, who was a wine critic. I based the vineyard in Blush on an actual vineyard. The first winery on Long Island was in 1971, a family called the Hargraves, a husband and wife, started, they got an old potato farm and they made it into a vineyard. People thought it couldn't be done. They thought you could only grow Concord grapes, not the types of grapes that made wine, but they did it. And they created, I mean, now you drive up and down that highway and it's just vineyard after vineyard after vineyard. But in the beginning, it was just Louisa Thomas Hargrave, and she wrote a memoir called The Vineyard. So I got a lot of really nice details about just the backbreaking work of making wine and how it's, you know, it's an art, it's a craft, it's field work, it's everything. So those are the things that really gave me everything I needed to put Blush together on the page.
A lot of hands-on research.
Yeah.
For Blush and so on. We've got maybe just two more, unless there's other questions from our audience here. But
I have one. I can wait. I can go.
Okay, gotcha. Yeah, we'll do this one. This just talks about you enjoy multi-generational stories, incorporating those in your plot, because they're both in Blush and Guilt.
Yes. Do I like important?
Do you enjoy, I guess,
Oh.
incorporating those, or do you personally enjoy reading?
I
that
love,
type of story?
I love reading multi-generational stories. And when I was growing up, when novels were epic and they were all 800 pages, you know, that's where I really first got the taste for family stories and how sort of the sins of one generation kind of roll into the next, and some things are never resolved, and how time doesn't really heal everything. And the older books played with that in a much longer form. And as I said today, we have much shorter books, but I'd like to, so I set my multi-generations in one summer or one house. Instead of spanning 60 years, it's just those people are all together over the course of 2 or 3 months. And I like writing from different generational perspectives because I feel, you know, now that I'm in my 50s, each stage of life, you understand so much more, and you have so much more, you have more baggage, you have more knowledge, you have more relationships. So I like to have the perspective of the 20-something person who has so much to learn, but it doesn't realize it yet. Then I love writing from my vantage point, because you can look back and look forward. And I really like inhabiting the shoes of a 70 or 80-year-old woman, because I imagine how much more, you know, I would know by that time, and how much more I hopefully will have done. And I can't write from experience about that age, but my favorite characters are always older, because I imagine people who have, you know, seen and done so much, and they have so much to say if someone will just stop and really listen to them. So that's why I tend to write the multi-generational story. Patty, you had a question?
Thank you. Yes. So I noticed on Facebook that you had been posting a lot of the different pieces of jewelry.
Yes.
And they were so beautiful. And I was just, so did somebody actually model those, or where did you get the jewelry or the pictures?
Okay, so some things, like these are all Lulu Frost. So
Okay.
sometimes I posted my things, sometimes I pulled from her feeds. Sometimes I post my own, like this I got from Pippin Vintage in New York City. And then sometimes, you know, the interesting thing about jewelry, which I write about this in Guilt, is now you don't have to go to Tiffany or Cartier to see or buy extraordinary jewelry. You know, social media, there's fabulous designers and artists just selling straight from their accounts. And jewelry has its own life. You know, there's a place, Market Square Jewelry, and you might have seen they'll put like stacks of rings on every
Yes,
finger,
yes.
and then just post it on Instagram.
Yes.
And I repost those because they're stunning.
Yes, they're
Yeah,
beautiful.
so that's Market Square, and the first person I saw posting that particular aesthetic is that particular company.
Yeah, okay. I was so drawn to those. Like,
I
just
know.
staring at them. They're beautiful.
Oh, you can go down a jewelry wormhole on Instagram. I mean,
Yeah.
it's amazing I get any reading done at this point. So,
Did you treat yourself to anything while you were doing research?
It was very dangerous research. I mean, it was one thing to drink a lot of wine with blush, but this got very expensive. So yes, I did buy some pieces, and I really never realized how much I love estate jewelry until I started going into this world. And I realized, like, there's this thing called filigree setting, which has all this very ornate engraving, which they used to do. And I actually learned, like, what is my favorite type of jewelry just by researching it. I wouldn't have said 3 years ago, oh, I'm really into estate jewelry, but now I am. And if you ever get the chance, I mean, even just going to the shops and talking to the curators, where they find these pieces, the story behind everyone.
That's so interesting.
I mean, jewelry really is, each piece is a story in itself when you find them that way.
Right. Thank
So,
you.
sure.
I've got one more question.
Sure.
And I'm curious if as I was reading, I was really interested when I started to understand the meaning behind the title, Guilt. I'm curious, is that something you want to talk about, or is that something that the reader should find?
Oh no, that's a good point. So guilt, I have to tell people when I say it out loud that it's G-I-L-T, which also is a homonym for guilt, when you feel bad about something. So, as I said, you know, this family made their fortune selling engagement rings, but all three sisters had tragic luck in love. And part of that was based on greedy decisions made by her parents, the parents. And the sisters ended up feeling guilty about things that happened. So we have guilt, which is like the gold sheen on something that's plated, which is a superficial beauty and shine. And then you have, obviously, guilt, which is the emotion that these characters, unfortunately, are grappling with through most of the book. So that's the double meaning.
Yeah, I love that.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all.